For 30 years, they called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, the one fortress America was told it could never break. At dawn, the first pilot crossed the reef.
All stations, attack!
Expecting the most powerful fleet on Earth.
At 06:45 on the morning of February 17, 1944, a Hellcat pilot from the carrier Yorktown pushed his nose over the coral rim of Truk Lagoon and looked down at the anchorage the entire United States Navy had spent 2 years learning to fear. He had been briefed to expect battleships, heavy cruisers, and the beating heart of the Japanese combined fleet ringed by anti-aircraft guns. What he saw instead were freighters, tankers, and repair ships sitting motionless on turquoise water, and almost nothing that could throw a serious punch back at a fleet. The Tigers were gone. Someone had emptied the cage a week before he arrived, and the pilot did not yet understand why. Over the next 48 hours, the ships and aircraft of Task Force 58 would sink roughly 40 vessels at Truk, around 200,000 tons of shipping, and destroy more than 250 Japanese aircraft. They would erase in 2 days the base that Japan had spent a decade calling the Gibraltar of the Pacific. And they would do it without ever fighting the battle fleet the base had been built to shelter. That absence, not the bombing, is the real story of Truk. This is the story of how Japan lost its greatest naval fortress without the decisive fleet action it had planned there for years, and why the ships that could have contested it were already 1,200 miles away when the first bomb fell. To understand the morning of February 17th, you have to go back 1 week to a decision made by one anxious man standing on the bridge of the largest warship afloat. His name was Admiral Mineichi Koga, and he commanded the entire Japanese combined fleet from the flag bridge of the super battleship Musashi, anchored deep inside Truk Lagoon. Truk was not a harbor Japan had seized in the war. It was a possession Japan had held since 1914 and fortified quietly for a decade across the Caroline Islands, far from any foreign eyes. The lagoon was 40 miles across, ringed by a coral barrier reef, broken by only a few passages, its islands carrying airfields, seaplane ramps, machine shops, hospitals, and fuel farms. It was a natural fortress the size of an inland sea. For 2 years, the combined fleet had used Truk as its central anchorage, the springboard for Guadalcanal, the Solomons, and the whole South Pacific campaign. When American sailors imagined the enemy's power, they pictured Truk. They pictured it because they had never seen it. No American had photographed the lagoon up close, and rumor filled the gap with 16-inch shore batteries and a fleet that never slept. Truk became a myth before it ever became a target. Then, in the first days of February 1944, the ground under Admiral Koga shifted. The Americans took the Marshall Islands, and they took them far faster than Tokyo believed possible. Kwajalein, Roy Namur, and the surrounding atolls fell in a matter of days at the start of February. The Marshalls had been the outer fence of the empire, and the fence was simply gone. Truk sat only about 670 miles behind that fence. Overnight, the Gibraltar of the Pacific had moved from the safe rear area into the striking range of American carrier aircraft, and Koga knew it. On February 4th, 2 American reconnaissance aircraft flew high over the lagoon and photographed it for the first time. The Japanese saw them come and understood exactly what the cameras meant. Koga did the arithmetic every cautious commander eventually does. He asked what he would lose if the enemy struck Truk while his fleet lay at anchor, unable to run. The answer was everything that mattered. Battleships cannot dodge inside a reef, and carriers cannot launch aircraft from a mooring buoy. A fleet caught at anchor is not a fleet, it is a row of targets. So on February 10, 1944, Admiral Koga ordered the striking heart of the combined fleet to abandon Truk. The super battleships, the fleet carriers, and the heavy cruisers weighed anchor and steamed west toward Palau and north toward home waters. Musashi herself pulled out, and with her went the great guns that were supposed to make Truk untouchable. The most powerful warships on Earth sailed away from the base they existed to defend. On its own terms, it was a sound decision. Koga saved his irreplaceable capital ships from a trap that would have swallowed them. But a base is not just its warships, and Truk, on February 16th, was still dangerously, fatally full. What remained inside the lagoon that night was not a battle fleet. It was a traffic jam of roughly 50 ships that had nowhere else to be. There were freighters, ammunition ships, and troop transports. There were fleet oilers heavy with the fuel that fed the whole Pacific War. There were submarine tenders and repair ships that kept the front line alive. Everything Japan had staged forward sat at anchor together. Guarding this horde were only second-line warships, the light cruisers Naka, Katori, and Agano, a scattering of destroyers, and a few submarine chasers. Against 9 carriers, it was almost nothing. On the airfields sat about 350 aircraft, many under repair, many without trained crews, and all of them short of the one thing that mattered most: warning. The base commander was Vice Admiral Mineichi Koga, and he knew the marshals had fallen. What he did not know was that the storm was already at sea and closing on him in the dark. That storm had a name. It was called Task Force 58, and it was the most concentrated mass of naval air power the world had ever assembled in one place. 9 aircraft carriers steamed together. 5 big fleet carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, and 4 fast light carriers. Between them, they carried more than 500 aircraft. Around the carriers moved a screen of new fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, a floating fortress that carried its own airfields wherever it went. This was a weapon that had not existed anywhere on Earth 2 years earlier. The force was commanded at sea by Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, a small sun-dried aviator who wore a long-billed cap backward against the wind and almost never raised his voice. He had flown since the earliest days of naval aviation, and he thought in 3 dimensions. Over Mitscher flew the flag of Admiral Raymond Spruance, the victor of Midway, embarked on the new battleship New Jersey. Spruance was no shouter either. He was a mathematician of violence, quiet, precise, and entirely without sentiment. The operation was codenamed Hailstone, and its logic was simple and merciless. First, sweep the sky empty of Japanese aircraft with fighters alone. Then, once nothing could rise to meet them, sink everything that floated. And this time, for the first time in the war, the killing would not stop when the sun went down. Mitscher intended to attack Truk around the clock and give the base no darkness in which to breathe. On the night of February 16th, Task Force 58 reached its launch position about 90 miles northeast of Truk, having crossed hundreds of miles of open ocean without being spotted. The Japanese search planes had missed them entirely. Before the carriers even turned into the wind, the first blood was drawn beneath the surface. The light cruiser Agano had already left Truk and was steaming north when the submarine Skate found her in her periscope. Skate fired a spread of torpedoes and struck Agano squarely. The cruiser rolled over and sank, taking hundreds of her crew with her. One of Truk's few real warships was gone before the air battle had even begun. At 0443, the carriers swung into the wind and began to launch aircraft into the darkness. The first wave was not a single bomb. It was 72 Hellcat fighters sent ahead to break the door off its hinges. They climbed away in the dark, joined into formations over the blacked-out task force, and set course for a lagoon that was only just beginning to stir awake. Behind them, the deck crews were already spotting the bombers. At Truk, the defenders did manage to scramble fighters, but they were climbing into a fight whose shape they had already lost. The Hellcats arrived with height, speed, and numbers, exactly the 3 advantages that decide air combat. The American fighters fell on the climbing Japanese planes out of the early light, and the sky over the lagoon dissolved into a series of short, savage, one-sided engagements. Many defenders were caught still clawing for altitude, wheels barely up. A Japanese fighter that has not yet reached its attacker's height is not a fighter. It is a target that happens to be moving. Dozens were shot down in the first hour, tumbling into the reef and the water inside it. By the time the sun stood fully over the lagoon, Japanese air power at Truk had been broken as an organized force. The survivors scattered, and the sky belonged to the men from the carriers. The Hellcats then dropped down onto the airfields themselves and strafed the rows of parked aircraft that had never gotten off the ground. Machines Japan could not replace, tended by mechanics who could not save them, burned in their revetments. With the sky swept clean, the second phase began, and this was the phase Truk had no answer for. Wave after wave of dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes crossed the reef and found a lagoon crowded with ships that could not run. The barrier reef that had made Truk a fortress now made it a killing pen. There were only a few passages out. The ships were packed close, and there was nowhere inside the lagoon to hide from an aircraft coming down out of the sun. The dive bombers rolled in on the anchored vessels one after another, releasing at a few thousand feet and pulling out low over the water. Within the first hour, columns of oily black smoke were climbing thousands of feet over the islands. The fleet oilers were among the first to die. Tankers heavy with fuel took bomb hits and became lakes of burning oil, their smoke so thick it darkened the lagoon beneath them. The lifeblood of the Japanese Pacific Fleet was set alight at its own anchorage. The armed merchant cruiser Ikoku Maru, loaded with ammunition and troops, took a direct hit and detonated in a single catastrophic explosion. The blast was so enormous it flung debris higher than the attacking aircraft and damaged the very plane that had bombed her. More than 700 men aboard Ikoku Maru died in that instant. The explosion was so violent that pilots miles away turned to look, and it became the single image many of them carried out of Truk for the rest of their lives. The submarine tender Heian Maru, at over 11,000 tons, the largest ship in the lagoon, was bombed and sunk with the spare torpedoes and stores meant to keep Japan's submarines at sea. Ship by ship, the machinery that sustained the fleet was being dismantled. The aircraft ferry Fujikawa Maru, her holds packed with disassembled fighters, went down with her cargo of wings and fuselages still crated. Japan was losing not just ships, but the aircraft inside them, sunk before they ever flew. The transport San Francisco Maru settled to the bottom with tanks, trucks, and sea mines still lashed to her decks. An entire garrison's worth of equipment, bound for some island to the south, never left the lagoon. By late morning, the anchorage was a checkerboard of burning hulls, drifting smoke, and men in the water. The attack had been going for barely 4 hours, and Truk was already unrecognizable as a naval base. Some ships did try to escape, running for the reef passages to reach the open sea beyond. That was exactly the move Admiral Spruance had planned to punish, and he did not leave the punishment to his aircraft. In a decision rare for a fleet commander, Spruance took a surface group out himself to hunt the ships fleeing Truk. He led the fast battleships Iowa and New Jersey, with cruisers and destroyers, on a clockwise circuit around the atoll. It was an extraordinary sight. 16-inch battleship guns designed to duel enemy dreadnoughts being turned on light cruisers and destroyers. Spruance meant to seal every exit with steel. His surface group caught the old training cruiser Katori and the destroyer Maikaze, trying to slip away to the northwest. The great guns opened fire, and against warships, a fraction of their size, the outcome was never in doubt. Katori was battered under the waterline by gunfire and went down outside the reef. The destroyer Maikaze was overwhelmed and sank with every man aboard. There were no survivors to tell what her last minutes had been like. Inside the lagoon, the light cruiser Naka was caught by aircraft and broken in two, and she slid under as well. One by one, the last real teeth of Truk were being pulled and thrown into the sea. There is a cruelty inside this story that is worth sitting with for a moment. The destroyer Oite had earlier taken aboard several hundred survivors from the sunken cruiser Agano and was bringing them back toward Truk for safety. Oite steamed straight into the American attack and was hit and sunk almost immediately, taking down both her own crew and the Agano survivors she had rescued. Around 570 men died, many of them sailors who had already survived one sinking hours before. They had lived through the loss of their cruiser, only to go down a second time on the ship that saved them. War rarely arranges its ironies so precisely, and it is worth remembering that these numbers were once men with names. It took 8 hours to compile every ship's name, every tonnage, and every squadron's claim for this account, and to separate what was truly sunk from what was only damaged and later salvaged. If that kind of accuracy is why you are still here, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe, because it tells us to keep making them exactly like this. By the afternoon of February 17th, the lagoon was a field of burning and settling ships, and the smoke had merged into a single pall that could be seen for 50 miles. And yet the first day was not finished, because Mitscher had promised there would be no night. When the sun went down over Truk, the attack did not stop. It changed form into something the world had never seen from an aircraft carrier before. For the first time in history, a carrier launched a coordinated night torpedo attack guided entirely by radar. The squadron was Torpedo 10 from the carrier Enterprise, which had trained in the dark for exactly this moment. The officer who had invented the tactics, Lieutenant Commander William Martin, had been injured in an accident just before the strike and lay grounded while the mission he built went ahead without him. It is a hard thing to design a first and then be forced to watch it from a sickbay. So the 12 Avengers were led into the blackness by Lieutenant Commander Van Eesen, each crew hunting its targets on a small green radar screen rather than by eye. They flew out over water so dark the horizon had vanished. They came in low below 300 feet, using the glow of the fires still burning ashore to throw the anchored ships into silhouette. One after another, they dropped their torpedoes at vessels they could barely see, guided by instruments and nerve. In a single night attack, that one squadron claimed hits on a long string of ships and sank several outright. It was a result so far beyond what anyone expected that senior officers questioned the numbers until the reconnaissance photographs confirmed them. What Torpedo 10 flew over Truk that night was a glimpse of the entire future of naval air warfare. The aircraft carrier as a weapon that never has to sleep. It was demonstrated for the first time above a lagoon that was already burning. The Japanese managed exactly one meaningful blow in reply, and it came from the few aircraft their surviving airfields could still put up. A handful of torpedo planes found Task Force 58 in the dark and bored in on the carrier Intrepid. A torpedo struck Intrepid near the stern on the starboard side, killing 11 men and jamming her rudder hard over so she could only steam in circles. Her crew rigged a makeshift sail from hatch covers and canvas to help drag her bow back onto a straight course. Intrepid limped out of the battle and began the long crawl back toward Pearl Harbor for repair. It was the one real wound Japan inflicted in 2 days, a single damaged carrier, and it had cost them a base. On the morning of February 18th, the aircraft came back over Truk to finish the work methodically. They struck the ships still stubbornly afloat, the airfields, the fuel dumps, and the repair shops that turned an anchorage into a base. By the time Task Force 58 finally turned away from the Carolines, the lagoon behind it was a graveyard wrapped in smoke. The Gibraltar of the Pacific had held for exactly one morning of real fighting. When the counting was finished, the totals were almost impossible to believe for 2 days of work. Roughly 40 ships had been sunk, on the order of 200,000 tons, including 2 light cruisers, several destroyers, and a fleet's worth of tankers and cargo vessels. More than 250 aircraft had been destroyed, the greater part of Truk's air strength, in the air and on the ground. The cost to the United States was 25 aircraft, a number of aircrew, and 1 carrier damaged. That is not a battle, that is a demolition. And it is worth stating plainly that the exchange was this lopsided not because the defenders were cowards, but because the one force that could have made it a fight was somewhere else. Here is how it unfolded in order. On February 4th, American reconnaissance photographed Truk and confirmed the combined fleet was still there, which is what convinced Admiral Koga to leave. On February 10th, Koga withdrew the fleet's capital ships to Palau, saving them but abandoning the base and the 50 vessels that could not keep up. On February 16th, the submarine Skate sank the cruiser Agano, and Task Force 58 reached its launch point undetected. At dawn on February 17th, 72 Hellcats swept the sky clear of Japanese aircraft within hours. Through the day, dive bombers and torpedo planes destroyed the shipping trapped inside the reef, while Admiral Spruance took battleships around the atoll to sink the ships that tried to flee. That night, Torpedo 10 flew the first radar-guided carrier night attack in history, and Japan's one answer was a torpedo into Intrepid. On February 18th, The carriers returned to finish the base, and then the task force simply sailed away. 4 factors decided what happened at Truk. First, timing. The Americans struck within 2 weeks of taking the Marshalls, before Japan could reinforce Truk's air defenses or evacuate its shipping. The base was caught exactly mid-transition, at its most vulnerable. Second, the withdrawal itself. Koga's choice to save the fleet meant the one force capable of contesting Task Force 58 at sea was simply not present. The great carrier versus carrier battle everyone expected never happened because one side had already declined it. Third, the fighter sweep. By sending fighters ahead of the bombers, the Americans destroyed Truk's air power before it could organize a defense, and then attacked the shipping almost at leisure. Order of operations won the battle before most of the bombs fell. Fourth, relentlessness. The night attack meant Truk was given no darkness to fight its fires, patch its hulls, and rearm its guns. A base can do one of those things at a time, not all 3 at once. And Mitscher never let the pressure lift for 48 hours. But there is a single reversal worth stating plainly. Truk did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the strength it had been built around had already sailed over the horizon a week before, and the men who stayed did fire back. Their anti-aircraft gunners fought until their ships went under them, their pilots died climbing to reach the Hellcats, and their torpedo planes crippled a fleet carrier in the dark. What never fired back was the battle fleet the entire base existed to serve. Japan lost its greatest naval fortress. Without the decisive fleet action, it had spent 2 years preparing to fight there. The title of this story is not a figure of speech. The main fleet never traded a single salvo in Truk's defense. And there is a second reversal folded inside the first, which is the part the histories tend to rush past. Admiral Koga's withdrawal was correct. Saving Yamato, Musashi, and the carriers preserved the fleet for the great battle Japan still believed it could win. But that battle came only 4 months later, in the Philippine Sea, and there the preserved fleet was shattered anyway. Its aircraft shot out of the sky in a single afternoon that American pilots nicknamed a turkey shoot. So the ships saved at Truk were not saved for victory. They were saved for a later and larger defeat. Koga's caution bought time, and time was the one resource the outcome did not actually turn on. After February 1944, Truk was finished as a functioning base. But here is the strange part. It was never invaded. No Marines ever waded ashore, and no flag was ever raised over it in battle. The Americans simply went around it. They cut its supply lines, isolated it behind the advancing front, and left its garrison of tens of thousands of men to wither on the vine. A phrase the planners used without irony. For the next 18 months, the soldiers and sailors marooned on Truk grew their own vegetables, fished the lagoon, fought hunger and disease, and waited for an enemy who had decided they were not worth the cost of killing. They finally surrendered in September 1945, having never fired a shot at an invader, because the invader never came. The strongest fortress in the Pacific was defeated not by assault, but by being made irrelevant. Today, the lagoon holds one of the largest concentrations of shipwrecks anywhere on Earth. Dozens of the vessels sunk in those 2 days still rest on the bottom, close enough to the surface that divers move through them daily. Inside their holds sit trucks, motorcycles, sake bottles, gas masks, aircraft engines, and stacks of shells, slowly disappearing beneath 80 years of coral. Truk Lagoon has become an accidental museum of a single morning of war. But they are also war graves, and the men who went down with these ships are still inside many of them. Divers are asked to look and not to touch, because the coral-covered shapes in the dark were once sailors with homes and names. Truk was not the largest battle of the Pacific War, and no famous invasion is named after it. It produced no beach, no flag raising, and no monument that most people would recognize. But it was the day the Gibraltar of the Pacific stopped being a fortress and became a target. It was the moment Japan's central position in the ocean collapsed, without the decisive battle it had been designed from the keel up to fight. That is how America actually won its war in the Pacific, not with one great and glorious clash of fleets, but by rendering the enemy's strongest points irrelevant, one after another, until the map itself had turned against them. Truk was the largest and most feared of those strongpoints, and it fell in 48 hours to an enemy its own fleet had already fled. There is a lesson in that about power and about how quickly the appearance of strength can outlive the reality of it. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how the next strongpoint fell and how the fleet that escaped Truk finally met its end. Turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.